Karoline Leavitt had always been someone who questioned the world around her. Growing up in a small town, she learned early on that things weren't always as they seemed. Her dad worked at a local factory, and her mom cleaned houses to make ends meet. They didn't have much, but they taught her the value of hard work and honesty. From a young age, Karoline loved reading newspapers and watching the news. She wanted to know what was happening in the world, especially stories about people who didn't have a voice. But as she grew older, something started bothering her. The news didn't feel real anymore. It felt like there was an agenda behind every headline, a hidden motive shaping the way stories were told. This became even clearer when it came to issues like homelessness. Every now and then, she'd see flashy reports about how bad homelessness was in big cities, but nothing ever seemed to change. No one really talked about why these problems existed or what could be done to fix them. Instead, it all felt surface level, more about making headlines than helping people. Karoline decided to become a journalist because she believed telling the truth mattered. She thought if she worked hard enough, she could shine a light on the real issues and maybe even inspire change. But after years in the field, she realized just how tough it was to get honest stories out there. Editors pushed her to write pieces that fit certain narratives, and sometimes facts got twisted along the way. Frustrated, Karoline began wondering, was the media really serving the public? Or was it just another tool for pushing agendas? One day, while scrolling through social media, she stumbled upon a comment thread debating homelessness. Some users argued that the problem was exaggerated by liberal media to push their own ideas. Others claimed the media ignored the issue entirely unless it suited their narrative. Reading those comments sparked an idea in Karoline's mind, an idea so bold it scared her. What if she went undercover as a homeless person? Could she uncover the truth about how the press handled such a critical issue? The thought wouldn't leave her alone. For weeks, she wrestled with the decision. Going undercover would mean stepping far outside her comfort zone. She'd have to give up everything familiar, her cozy apartment, her daily routines, even her sense of safety. But deep down, she knew this might be the only way to truly understand what was going on. If she wanted answers, she'd have to live the story herself. Finally, after months of planning, Karoline made up her mind. She packed a small backpack with essentials, a notebook, a pen, some cash, just in case, and a tiny recording device cleverly disguised as a button. Then came the hardest part, transforming her appearance. She rummaged through thrift stores for old, worn-out clothes that smelled faintly of mildew. Back home, she smeared dirt on her face and arms, letting the grime settle into her skin. Looking, in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Gone was the confident journalist. In her place stood someone who looked like they'd been forgotten by society. With a heavy heart, Karoline stepped out onto the streets of New York City. The air hit her differently now, not crisp and fresh like before, but thick with exhaust fumes and the scent of stale food. As night fell, she wandered aimlessly until she found a group of people huddled under a bridge. Their faces were tired, their eyes hollow, but there was a quiet camaraderie among them. Taking a deep breath, Karoline approached cautiously, clutching her backpack tightly. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked softly, trying to sound unsure of herself. A man nodded toward an empty spot beside him without saying a word. Grateful, Karoline lowered herself to the ground, feeling the cold concrete seep through her thin jacket. Around her, conversations buzzed quietly, stories of lost jobs, broken families, and dreams that had slipped away. For the first time, she wasn't just hearing about homelessness. She was living it. That first night was brutal. The temperature dropped sharply and the biting wind cut through her layers like knives. Sleep was impossible. Every noise, the distant rumble of traffic, the shuffle of feet nearby, kept her on edge. Yet what struck her most wasn't the physical discomfort. It was the overwhelming sense of invisibility. People walked past without a second glance, their eyes fixed ahead as if she didn't exist. It was a strange kind of loneliness, one that gnawed at her soul more than the hunger or the cold. By morning, Karoline's body ached, and her resolve wavered. Was this really worth it? Just as doubt crept in, A woman sitting across from her handed over a cup of coffee. "Here," she said simply, her voice warm despite the chill in the air. That small act of kindness reminded Karoline why she was doing this. These were human beings, each carrying their own burdens yet still capable of compassion. If she could bring attention to their struggles, maybe, just maybe, it would make a difference. And with that thought, she steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. By the second day, Karoline began to notice patterns in the rhythm of street life. The mornings were quiet, almost peaceful, as the city slowly woke up. People shuffled around, some heading to work, while others rummaged through trash bins for scraps or bottles they could sell. By noon, the streets buzzed with activity, cars honking, vendors shouting, and pedestrians rushing past without a glance at those sitting on the sidewalks. But as night fell, the energy shifted again. It became darker, lonelier, and more dangerous. Karoline quickly learned that survival wasn't just about finding food or staying warm. It was about trust. She realized she couldn't just blend in by looking the part. She had to act it too. At first, her attempts to strike up conversations felt awkward. Her questions came out too polished, too rehearsed. One older man gave her a wary look when she asked how long he'd been living on the streets. "You ain't one of them reporters, are you?" he said gruffly. Karoline froze, unsure how to respond. Thankfully, another person nearby laughed and broke the tension. "Nah, she's just new here," they chimed in, saving her from suspicion. That moment taught her an important lesson. People on the streets weren't naive. Many had encountered journalists before, reporters who promised to tell their stories, but ultimately used them for sensational headlines without delivering any real help. These experiences left scars, making them cautious about opening up to strangers. Karoline knew she had to earn their trust if she wanted to understand their lives and uncover the truth about how the media treated them. Over time, she started building connections. She listened more than she spoke, nodding along as others shared fragments of their lives. A middle-aged woman talked about losing her job during the pandemic and being evicted months later. A younger guy recounted how addiction spiraled out of control after his brother died unexpectedly. Each story was different, yet they all carried the same thread of pain and resilience. Karoline wrote down snippets in her notebook, careful not to draw attention to herself. These weren't just facts for a report. These were pieces of humanity. One afternoon, while sitting near a busy intersection, Karoline noticed a group of volunteers handing out sandwiches and blankets. They worked for a local nonprofit, their logo emblazoned on bright vests. Curious, she joined the line, accepting a sandwich and striking up a conversation with one of the volunteers. "We come out here twice a week," the woman explained. "But we can only do so much. What these folks really need is systemic change." Karoline nodded thoughtfully. As she ate her sandwich, she observed the scene closely. Some recipients greeted the volunteers warmly, clearly grateful for the help. Others accepted the food silently, their expressions guarded. A few refused altogether, muttering under their breath about charity not solving anything. It struck Karoline how complex the issue was. There wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Yet in the news, homelessness was often reduced to simple sound bites. Rising numbers, lack of affordable housing, or mental health crisis. None of those phrases captured the raw reality unfolding right in front of her eyes. Later, that evening, she found herself back under the bridge where she'd spent her first night. This time, she joined a small circle of people gathered around a makeshift fire someone had lit inside a metal drum. The flames crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on their faces. Conversation flowed easily now, fueled by shared struggles and fleeting moments of camaraderie. One man, whose weathered face suggested decades of hardship, began talking about his family. He hadn't seen his daughter in years, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "She thinks I'm dead," he said bitterly. "Probably better that way." The room fell silent except for the crackling fire. Karoline felt a lump rise in her throat. These weren't just statistics or vague figures in a report. They were fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. Their stories deserved to be told, not dismissed or distorted for clicks and views. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that most journalists wouldn't take the time to listen like this. They'd skim the surface, grab a quick quote, and move on to the next assignment. As the days turned into weeks, Karoline started paying closer attention to how the press interacted with the homeless community. Occasionally, she'd spot reporters conducting interviews near shelters or soup kitchens. At first glance, it seemed promising. They were asking questions, taking notes, even filming segments. But the longer she watched, the clearer it became that something was off. One morning, she overheard a reporter speaking with a man who looked barely old enough to shave. His clothes were dirty, his hair matted, but his words carried weight as he described growing up in foster care and aging out of the system. "I've been on my own since I was 18, he said. "Nobody cares what happens to kids like me once we turn legal adults." The reporter nodded sympathetically, jotting down notes. But when the camera crew arrived, the tone changed completely. The producer instructed the reporter to focus on lighter topics: how many meals the shelter served daily, for example, or how generous donors kept operations running. The young man's story? Barely mentioned. Karoline's stomach churned as she witnessed similar scenes play out repeatedly. Reporters cherry-picked details that fit their narrative, ignoring anything too messy or complicated. Worse still, she noticed how often they avoided engaging deeply with the people they interviewed. Conversations were rushed, questions superficial. Once the cameras stopped rolling, the crews packed up and left, leaving behind the same broken system they claimed to care about. It wasn't just negligence, it was manipulation. Karoline saw firsthand how easy it was to shape public perception by selectively highlighting certain aspects of homelessness while glossing over others. For instance, addiction and mental illness were frequently portrayed as the root causes of homelessness, reinforcing stereotypes rather than addressing broader issues like skyrocketing rent prices or lack of social services. Meanwhile, stories of hard-working individuals priced out of their homes due to gentrification rarely made headlines. The hypocrisy gnawed at her. Here were journalists claiming to shed light on societal problems, yet their methods often perpetuated stigma instead of fostering understanding. Karoline knew she couldn't stay silent about what she was witnessing. Every ignored story, every misrepresented fact, it all added fuel to her determination to expose the truth. But as she settled down for another restless night on the cold ground, she couldn't help wondering, would anyone believe her when she finally revealed what she'd discovered? As Karoline continued living on the streets, she began noticing something even more unsettling. The people who were supposed to help often didn't. Sure, there were compassionate souls, volunteers handing out food, kind strangers offering spare change, but they were exceptions rather than the rule. What struck her most was how invisible the homeless population seemed to everyone else. It wasn't just indifference. It was like an entire segment of society had been erased from public consciousness. One afternoon, while sitting on a park bench with her backpack clutched tightly against her chest, Karoline watched as a group of well-dressed professionals strolled by. They laughed and chatted animatedly, completely oblivious to the man curled up on the grass just a few feet away. His thin blanket barely covered him, and his face was gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. Yet no one stopped. No one asked if he needed help. To them, he might as well have been part of the scenery, a tree, a lamppost, anything but a human being in desperate need. Karoline felt anger bubbling inside her, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't afford to let emotions take over. Not yet. Instead, she focused on observing, soaking in every detail. That's when she noticed another pattern. When reporters did show up, their presence often disrupted the fragile balance of life on the streets. People grew nervous, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Some feared retaliation if they said the wrong thing, while others worried their words would be twisted to fit some predetermined narrative. One day, a local news crew arrived at a shelter where Karoline had spent several nights. The team set up lights and cameras, turning what should have been a safe space into a chaotic spectacle. Residents were ushered around like props, told where to stand and how to act. One elderly woman, frail and trembling, was asked to recount her struggles for the camera. Her voice wavered as she spoke about losing her home and family, But halfway through her story, the producer interrupted. "Let's keep it short," he said brusquely. "We've got other interviews lined up." Karoline clenched her fists in frustration. This wasn't storytelling, it was exploitation. These journalists weren't there to amplify voices, they were there to check boxes. Once the cameras were packed away, the crew left without so much as a thank you to the people who'd shared their lives. And the residents? They returned to their routines, shaken and disillusioned, wondering why they'd bothered opening up in the first place. But it wasn't just the treatment of individuals that troubled Karoline. It was the way certain organizations received attention while others were ignored. During her time undercover, she encountered countless nonprofits working tirelessly to address homelessness. Some ran shelters, others provided job training or mental health support. Yet only a handful ever made it into the news, and usually for reasons unrelated to their actual impact. For example, one small organization dedicated to helping veterans reintegrate into civilian life struggled to gain visibility despite its impressive track record. Its founder, a soft-spoken man with calloused hands and a weary smile, explained that funding was always tight. "If we could get more exposure, maybe donors would step up," he told Karoline one evening. But when she checked online, she found almost no mention of the group in mainstream outlets. Meanwhile, a flashier initiative focused on trendy causes, like planting trees or promoting eco-friendly products, garnered glowing write-ups, even though its connection to homelessness was tenuous at best. This glaring disparity infuriated Karoline. Why were resources and attention funneled toward projects that aligned with popular movements rather than those making tangible differences? It wasn't hard to see the bias at play. Stories about climate activism or social justice buzzwords generated clicks and shares, while quieter efforts to uplift marginalized communities went unnoticed. The media wasn't just failing to report the truth, it was actively shaping which causes mattered and which didn't. Despite her growing disillusionment, Karoline refused to give up. Every interaction, every observation fueled her determination to expose what she'd uncovered. She started jotting down notes late at night, scribbling furiously by the dim light of a street lamp. Her handwriting was messy, smudged with dirt and tears, but each word carried weight. She wrote about the young man abandoned by the foster care system, the elderly woman dismissed mid-story, the nonprofit fighting an uphill battle for recognition. These weren't just anecdotes, they were evidence of a broken system. Still, doubts lingered in the back of her mind. How would people react when she revealed the truth? Would they dismiss her findings as biased or exaggerated? Or worse, would they accuse her of fabricating details to push her own agenda? The thought terrified her, but she pushed it aside. If she wanted to make a difference, she had to take the risk. Besides, she reminded herself, she wasn't doing this for fame or validation. She was doing it because someone needed to tell these stories and do it right. One particularly cold night, as Karoline huddled under a thin blanket beside a stranger, whose name she didn't know, she realized something profound. This journey wasn't just about exposing media bias. It was about bearing witness. For weeks, she'd lived among people who'd been forgotten, ignored, and misunderstood. She'd seen their pain, their resilience, their humanity, and now it was her responsibility to ensure the world saw it too. The next morning, she woke up with renewed resolve. It was time to leave the streets. Not because she was tired of the experience, but because she knew she couldn't stay forever. She had gathered enough material to piece together a powerful exposé, one that would challenge the status quo and spark important conversations. As she walked away from the bridge where she'd spent so many nights, she glanced back one last time. The faces of the people she'd met flashed through her mind, reminding her of why she'd started this journey in the first place. Little did she know, what came next would test her courage and convictions like never before. Karoline's decision to leave the streets was bittersweet. She'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of life there, the quiet mornings, the hum of conversation under bridges, the shared meals that felt like feasts despite their simplicity. But more than anything, she'd formed connections with people who had welcomed her into their world without judgment. Leaving meant saying goodbye to those bonds, even if only temporarily. It also meant stepping back into a reality where she'd have to confront the weight of what she'd uncovered. Her first stop after returning to her apartment wasn't the shower or her bed, it was her laptop. Sitting at the cluttered kitchen table, she opened a blank document and stared at the screen for a long moment. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. This was it, the moment she'd been preparing for. Everything she'd experienced, every story she'd heard, every injustice she'd witnessed, it all needed to come together in a way that would grab people's attention and refuse to let go. She started typing, slowly at first, then faster as the words poured out of her. She wrote about the biting cold nights, the gnawing hunger, the feeling of being invisible to passers-by. She described the kindness of strangers who shared what little they had, and the frustration of seeing reporters exploit vulnerable people for sensational headlines. Each sentence carried emotion, raw and unfiltered. She didn't sugarcoat anything. This wasn't the time for soft edges or polite phrasing. The truth demanded to be told exactly as it was. As she worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and determination, Karoline realized something. Writing this exposé wasn't just about exposing media bias. It was about giving a voice to those who had none. Every quote she included, every detail she highlighted, served as a reminder that homelessness wasn't just a statistic, it was a lived experience. These were real people with dreams, fears, and histories, not caricatures used to sell newspapers or drive clicks. By sunrise, the first draft was complete. Exhausted but satisfied, Karoline leaned back in her chair and reread what she'd written. The piece was sharp, honest, and unapologetic. It pulled no punches when describing how certain journalists ignored deeper issues or manipulated stories to fit preconceived narratives. At the same time, it celebrated the resilience of the homeless community, shining a light on their humanity rather than reducing them to stereotypes. But before publishing, Karoline knew she had to double-check her facts. Accuracy mattered above all else. If even one detail was wrong, critics could dismiss her entire argument. So she spent the next few days combing through her notes, verifying dates, and re-listening to recordings she'd secretly captured during her time undercover. She wanted to make sure every claim she made was backed up by evidence. Only then did she feel confident enough to hit publish. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, her article went viral, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. Readers were captivated by its honesty and outraged by its revelations. Comments flooded in, ranging from heartfelt praise to angry accusations. Some called her brave, saying she'd exposed truths they'd suspected but never fully understood. Others accused her of exaggerating or fabricating details to push an anti-media agenda. Journalists themselves weighed in, with some defending their profession while others admitted the system was flawed. Major news outlets couldn't ignore the buzz. Soon invitations began pouring in, requests for interviews, panel discussions, and guest appearances on talk shows. Karoline agreed to a few, knowing this was her chance to amplify her message even further. During one televised interview, she held up a photo she'd taken undercover, a close-up of a man sleeping on cardboard beneath a flickering streetlight. "This is reality," she said firmly, looking directly into the camera. "These are human beings, not props for your headlines. If you're going to report on homelessness, do it with respect and integrity." Her words struck a nerve. Viewers tuned in, eager to hear more about her experiences. Many were shocked by the stark contrast between her account and the polished reports they'd seen on TV. Some even reached out to local shelters and nonprofits, inspired to make a difference. For the first time in years, homelessness dominated public discourse, not as a distant issue, but as something urgent and personal. However, not everyone appreciated Karoline's efforts. Powerful editors and producers pushed back hard, accusing her of unethical methods and bias. One prominent columnist dismissed her work as reckless activism masquerading as journalism. Another claimed her undercover stint was nothing more than a publicity stunt. Behind closed doors, industry insiders worked tirelessly to discredit her findings. planting doubts about her credibility wherever possible. Despite the backlash, Karoline remained steadfast. She knew criticism came with the territory, especially when challenging powerful institutions. What surprised her most, though, was the support she received from unexpected corners. Fellow journalists, some seasoned veterans, others fresh-faced, rookies, reached out privately to commend her courage. "You've reminded us why we got into this business," one wrote, "to tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable." Encouraged by these messages, Karoline decided to take her mission a step further. She launched a website dedicated to ethical storytelling, offering resources and guidelines for reporters covering marginalized communities. She hosted workshops, sharing insights from her time undercover, and urging aspiring journalists to prioritize empathy over sensationalism. Her goal wasn't to tear down the media, it was to rebuild it brick by brick into something better. Months passed, and the initial frenzy surrounding her exposé began to die down. But the ripple effects lingered. Conversations about homelessness continued, albeit less loudly. Nonprofits reported increased donations and volunteer sign-ups. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at addressing affordable housing shortages and improving mental health services. While progress was slow, it was undeniable. Change had begun. For Karoline, the journey wasn't over. Going undercover had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd started out wanting to expose bias, but she ended up learning something far more profound: the power of listening. By simply paying attention to the stories, struggles, and hopes of those around her, she'd uncovered a truth that resonated deeply with others. And in doing so, she reminded the world of something easy to forget. Journalism isn't about chasing headlines, it's about honoring humanity. Even now, whenever she sees someone sitting on a sidewalk holding a cardboard sign, she pauses. Not because she feels obligated to give money, but because she knows there's a story behind those eyes, a story worth hearing. As the dust settled from her explosive exposé, Karoline found herself at a crossroads. The whirlwind of attention had been both exhilarating and exhausting. On one hand, she felt vindicated. Her work had sparked important conversations and inspired some tangible changes. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. People were looking to her for answers, for guidance, for solutions. But how could she possibly live up to those expectations? One evening, after another long day of interviews and meetings, Karoline sat alone in her apartment, staring at the call wall. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but she ignored it. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to sit quietly and reflect. She thought about the people she'd met during her time undercover, their faces, their stories, their resilience. They weren't just subjects in an article. They were real individuals whose lives had intersected with hers in profound ways. And yet, despite all the progress she'd helped catalyze, so much remained unchanged. Homelessness was still a crisis, and many of the systemic issues she'd highlighted continued to fester. Affordable housing projects stalled due to red tape. Mental health services remained underfunded. Nonprofits struggled to keep their doors open. It was easy to feel defeated, to wonder if anything she'd done truly mattered. But then she remembered something one of the shelter residents had told her. Change doesn't happen overnight. You plant seeds, and maybe someday someone else will water them. Those words stuck with her now, reminding her that even small actions could create ripples. Sure, she hadn't solved homelessness single-handedly, and no one expected her to, but she'd planted seeds. Now it was up to others to nurture them. With renewed clarity, Karoline decided to shift her focus. Instead of trying to tackle everything at once, she resolved to concentrate on what she did best: storytelling. If there was one thing she'd learned from her journey, it was that stories had power. They could move people, inspire action, and challenge perceptions. So she began working on a new project, a series of in-depth profiles highlighting the lives of homeless individuals. Each story would delve deep into their experiences, capturing not just their struggles but also their triumphs, dreams, and humanity. To gather material, Karoline returned to the streets, not undercover this time, but as herself. She approached people she'd met before, explaining her plans and asking for their permission to share their stories. Some agreed immediately, eager to have their voices heard. Others hesitated, wary of being misrepresented again. Karoline respected their boundaries, assuring them she wouldn't publish anything without their approval. Slowly but surely, trust was rebuilt. One woman who had lived on the streets for nearly a decade opened up about her passion for art. Despite having almost nothing, she spent her days sketching portraits of strangers using scraps of paper and borrowed pencils. "It's my way of staying connected to the world," she explained, her eyes lighting up as she spoke. Karoline listened intently, jotting down notes and snapping photos of her artwork. When the profile was published, it struck a chord with readers. Donations poured in to help fund art supplies, and local galleries offered to showcase her work. For the first time in years, the woman saw a glimmer of hope for her future. Another profile featured a former construction worker who had fallen on hard times after an injury left him unable to perform physical labor. He spoke candidly about the shame he felt asking for help and the loneliness of losing touch with friends and family. His story resonated with countless readers, prompting offers of job training programs and temporary housing. Though the road ahead was still uncertain, he expressed gratitude for the unexpected support. Through these profiles, Karoline aimed to humanize homelessness, stripping away the stigma and stereotypes that often surrounded it. She wanted readers to see themselves in these stories, to realize that homelessness wasn't something that happened to other people. It could happen to anyone. A medical emergency, a lost job, a missed rent payment. It didn't take much for life to spiral out of control. The response to the series was overwhelming. Readers flooded Karoline's inbox with messages of appreciation, sharing how the stories had changed their perspectives. Some admitted they'd never thought twice about homelessness until reading her articles. Others described taking action, volunteering at shelters, donating clothes, or simply striking up conversations with people they might have otherwise ignored. Yet not everyone was pleased. Critics argued that Karoline's approach was too soft, too sympathetic. "You're glorifying bad choices," one commenter wrote angrily. Another accused her of ignoring personal accountability, claiming that homelessness was often the result of poor decisions rather than systemic failures. These comments stung, but Karoline refused to engage. She knew changing deeply ingrained attitudes wouldn't be easy, and she accepted that not everyone would agree with her perspective. What mattered most was reaching those who were willing to listen and inspiring them to act. Amidst the praise and criticism, Karoline received an unexpected invitation. A major media outlet asked her to join their team as a senior correspondent, tasked with covering social justice issues. At first, she hesitated. Could she really work within the same system she'd criticized so fiercely? Would accepting the role compromise her integrity? After much deliberation, she decided to accept, but only on her terms. She made it clear that she wouldn't shy away from holding powerful institutions accountable, including her own employer. Her new position gave her access to resources and platforms she'd never dreamed of before. She used this opportunity to push for change from within, advocating for more ethical reporting practices and greater representation of marginalized voices. She mentored young journalists, teaching them the importance of empathy and authenticity in storytelling. And perhaps most importantly, she continued amplifying the voices of those society often overlooked. Despite her growing influence, Karoline never lost sight of where she came from, or why she started this journey in the first place. Whenever she felt overwhelmed by the pressures of her career, she returned to the streets, not to report, but to reconnect, to remind herself of the humanity at the heart of every story, to honor the people who had trusted her with their truths. One chilly evening, as she walked through a park she'd once called home, she spotted a familiar face. It was the elderly man who had shared his story about aging out of foster care. He looked healthier now, his cheeks fuller, his eyes brighter. Spotting her, he waved and called out, "Hey, journalist lady." Karoline smiled and hurried over. They sat together on a bench, catching up like old friends. He told her about finding steady work at a community garden and reconnecting with a cousin who'd offered him a place to stay. "I owe a lot of that to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your article got me noticed by the right people." Karoline shook her head modestly. "No, you did the hard work. I just told your story." He chuckled softly. "Well, sometimes telling the story is half the battle." As they parted ways, Karoline felt a swell of pride, not in herself, but in the proof that progress was possible. Seeds had been planted, and some were beginning to sprout. There was still so much work to be done, but for now that was enough. Karoline's journey wasn't just about telling stories, it was about creating a ripple effect. The more she wrote, the more people started paying attention. What began as one woman's mission to expose bias and bring humanity to the forefront of journalism turned into a movement that inspired others to take action. But Karoline quickly realized that movements don't sustain themselves. They require constant effort, collaboration, and courage. One day, while attending a community event hosted by a local nonprofit, Karoline met a young volunteer who approached her with wide eyes. "I read your article," the girl said shyly. "It made me want to do something." She went on to explain how she'd organized a clothing drive at her school, collecting coats, socks, and blankets for shelters. "At first I thought no one would care," she admitted. "But so many kids got involved. We even raised money for a new washing machine at the shelter downtown." Karoline listened intently, feeling a mix of pride and humility. This teenager, barely old enough to drive, had taken her words and turned them into action. It reminded her of why she kept pushing forward despite the challenges. Every story she told had the potential to spark change, whether big or small. And sometimes it was the smallest actions that left the deepest impact. Encouraged by encounters like this, Karoline decided to expand her efforts beyond writing. She partnered with grassroots organizations, hosting workshops designed to teach storytelling skills to advocates and activists. Her goal was simple: empower others to share their own experiences in ways that resonated with audiences. "You don't need to be a professional journalist to tell a powerful story," she often said during these sessions. "All you need is honesty and heart." These workshops became safe spaces where participants could open up without fear of judgment. One session stood out in particular. A middle-aged man shared his experience of losing everything after a divorce. His voice trembled as he recounted sleeping in his car and skipping meals to save gas money. "For years I felt ashamed," he confessed, "like I'd failed somehow. But hearing your stories made me realize I'm not alone." By the end of the workshop, several attendees volunteered to collaborate on a project called Voices Unheard, a collection of personal essays written by individuals affected by homelessness. Karoline helped edit and publish the pieces, ensuring each author retained full control over their narrative. When the book launched, it sold out within days, with proceeds going directly to support housing initiatives. For many contributors, seeing their words in print was transformative, a reclaiming of dignity and identity. Despite the successes, Karoline faced ongoing resistance. Some critics accused her of glamorizing hardship or undermining traditional journalistic standards. Others dismissed her work as overly sentimental, claiming it lacked objectivity. While such comments frustrated her, they also reinforced her belief that the system needed reform. Objectivity, she argued, shouldn't mean detachment. True journalism required empathy, an understanding that behind every statistic was a human being with hopes, fears, and dreams. To counter the criticism, Karoline invited skeptics to join her on field visits. She took editors, producers, and reporters to shelters, soup kitchens, and encampments, encouraging them to engage directly with the people they covered. At first, many were hesitant, unsure of what to say or how to act. But over time, barriers began to break down. Conversations flowed naturally, revealing layers of complexity that couldn't be captured in a soundbite or headline. By the end of these outings, even the most hardened skeptics admitted they'd gained new perspectives. One producer, initially dismissive of Karoline's methods, later approached her privately. "I thought you were exaggerating," he admitted. "But seeing it firsthand, and it's different. You're right, we've been doing it wrong." Moments like these fueled Karoline's determination to keep pushing boundaries. She knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but every step forward mattered. Whether it was convincing a newsroom to rethink its approach or inspiring a high school student to start a fundraiser, progress came in unexpected forms. Still, Karoline couldn't ignore the toll her relentless advocacy was taking on her personal life. Long hours, constant travel, and emotional exhaustion left little room for rest. Friends urged her to slow down, warning that burnout was inevitable. Even her family expressed concern, reminding her that she couldn't save everyone. "You're only one person," her mom said gently during a rare visit home. "You've already done so much. Isn't it time to let someone else carry the torch?" Karoline nodded, knowing her mom meant well. But deep down, she wondered if stepping back would feel like giving up. Could she really trust others to continue the work she'd started? Or would the momentum fade once she stopped leading the charge? The question haunted her until a chance encounter provided clarity. While visiting a shelter to check in on a former resident featured in her profiles, Karoline noticed a young intern working tirelessly alongside staff members. The intern, barely out of college, introduced herself enthusiastically, explaining that she'd been inspired by Karoline's exposé to pursue a career in social justice reporting. "I never thought I could make a difference," the intern said, "but reading your articles showed me that even small steps can lead to big changes." Hearing those words, Karoline felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was exactly what she'd hoped for, not to be the sole voice of change, but to inspire others to find their own voices. She didn't have to carry the weight alone. There were plenty of hands ready to help lift it. With renewed energy, Karoline began delegating tasks and mentoring emerging journalists. She encouraged them to tackle tough topics, offering guidance without overshadowing their unique perspectives. Slowly, she stepped back from the spotlight, allowing newer voices to take center stage. It wasn't easy letting go, but it was necessary for her own well-being and for the sustainability of the movement. Even as she scaled back her public appearances, Karoline continued writing. Her articles shifted focus slightly, emphasizing solutions rather than problems. She highlighted innovative programs addressing homelessness, celebrated victories large and small, and profiled everyday heroes making a difference in their communities. Each piece served as a reminder that hope existed, even in the darkest corners of society. And then, one chilly winter morning, Karoline received an email that brought tears to her eyes. Attached was a photo of a newly constructed affordable housing complex, its walls painted bright colors and adorned with murals created by local artists. The caption read, "Thanks to your efforts, we broke ground on this project last year. Today, 50 families have keys to their own homes." For a moment, Karoline sat frozen, staring at the screen. All the late nights, the sacrifices, the battles, fought against cynicism and doubt. It had all been worth it. Seeds planted long ago had grown into something beautiful. Change was possible. Progress was real. As she closed her laptop and gazed out the window, snow beginning to fall softly outside, Karoline smiled. The road ahead would still be challenging, filled with obstacles and setbacks, but she knew now that she wasn't walking it alone. Together, brick by brick, seed by seed, they were building a better future, one story at a time. As the years passed, Karoline's role in the fight against homelessness evolved. She wasn't the same wide-eyed journalist who had once ventured onto the streets with nothing but a backpack and a notebook. Life had changed her, softened some edges while sharpening others. Her mission remained the same, but her approach became more strategic, more collaborative. She no longer saw herself as the sole storyteller. Instead, she viewed her work as part of a larger tapestry woven by countless hands. One crisp autumn morning, Karoline stood outside a community center buzzing with activity. It was the grand opening of a new program aimed at helping homeless veterans transition into stable housing and employment. The initiative had been years in the making, born from partnerships between nonprofits, local businesses, and government agencies. As she watched former service members tour their new apartments, shaking hands with caseworkers and volunteers, Karoline felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This was what progress looked like. Not perfect, not instantaneous, but real. She remembered the first time she'd pitched the idea for such a program to skeptical stakeholders. Many had dismissed it as too ambitious or impractical. "It'll take too long," one official had said. "We need quick wins." But Karoline refused to give up. Drawing on her experiences and connections, she worked tirelessly to bring people together, reminding them that even small victories mattered. Today, standing amidst laughter and tears of gratitude, she knew every ounce of effort had been worth it. But success didn't mean complacency. If anything, it made Karoline more determined to keep pushing boundaries. One of her newest projects involved creating a digital platform where individuals experiencing homelessness could share their own stories directly, without needing a journalist to amplify their voices. Called Our Voices, the platform allowed users to upload videos, write posts, or submit artwork anonymously if they chose. Each submission was moderated lightly, ensuring safety and respect without stifling authenticity. The response was incredible. Within weeks, hundreds of stories poured in, some heartbreaking, others uplifting, all deeply human. A young mother described fleeing domestic violence with her 2 kids, sleeping in parks until a stranger offered them shelter. An elderly man shared his love for poetry, penning verses about resilience and hope despite decades of hardship. A teenager posted photos of graffiti art he'd created under bridges, turning bleak spaces into vibrant expressions of defiance. Karoline scrolled through the entries late one night, her heart swelling with emotion. These weren't just stories, they were lifelines. For many contributors, sharing their experiences online was cathartic, a way to reclaim agency over their lives. Readers responded with messages of support, offers of help, and pledges to volunteer. What started as a simple idea blossomed into a global network of connection and compassion. Of course, challenges persisted. Not everyone embraced Karoline's vision. Some criticized the platform for lacking editorial oversight, claiming it diluted journalistic integrity. Others accused her of romanticizing homelessness, arguing that providing a platform wasn't enough to solve systemic issues. While these criticisms stung, Karoline welcomed them as opportunities to refine her work. She invited detractors to participate in focus groups, asking for feedback on how to improve our voices. By listening openly, she demonstrated that meaningful change required collaboration, not defensiveness. Through it all, Karoline never forgot the lessons she'd learned during her time undercover. Those cold nights huddled under bridges, those quiet conversations around flickering fires. They stayed with her, shaping every decision she made. She often revisited the notes she'd taken during those early days, rereading the words of people who had trusted her with their truths. Their stories reminded her why she'd started this journey in the first place, to honor humanity. Years later, when asked to reflect on her legacy, Karoline hesitated. Legacy felt like a heavy word, loaded with expectations she didn't want to carry. Instead, she preferred to think of her work as planting seeds. Some had grown into towering trees, providing shade and shelter for generations. Others were still tiny sprouts, fragile but full of potential. Either way, she took comfort, knowing she hadn't done it alone. Change belonged to everyone who dared to care, to listen, to act, to believe. Her final article before retiring from full-time journalism summed it up perfectly, titled, "The Power of Listening." It began with a simple anecdote, sitting on a park bench watching a child hand a flower to a man holding a cardboard sign. "In that moment," she wrote, "I realized something profound. Homelessness isn't just a problem to solve, it's a reminder of our shared humanity. When we stop, look each other in the eye, and truly listen, we begin to heal not only others but ourselves." When the piece went live, it resonated deeply with readers. Comments flooded in, thanking her for her dedication and urging her not to disappear entirely. Though Karoline stepped back from the limelight, she continued, mentoring young journalists, speaking at conferences, and supporting grassroots initiatives. Her voice may have softened, but her influence endured. On her last visit to the streets, a place that would always feel like home in its own strange way, Karoline sat quietly on a familiar bench. Around her, Life unfolded as it always had. Laughter, arguments, moments of quiet reflection. A man approached cautiously, recognizing her despite the years that had passed since their last meeting. "You're the journalist lady," he said with a grin. "Heard you're hanging up your pen?" Karoline chuckled softly. "Not exactly. Just trading it for something quieter." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Well, thanks for what you've done. You made folks see us differently." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. "No," she replied gently. "You did that. I just helped tell the story." As she walked away, blending into the crowd, Karoline felt lighter than she had in years. She didn't need applause or accolades. She already had everything she needed. The knowledge that her work had sparked ripples extending far beyond her reach. Seeds planted long ago had grown into forests, and new ones were being sown every day. And so Karoline Leavitt stepped out of the spotlight, content in the belief that the world was better, not because of her, but because of the collective efforts of ordinary people choosing to care. Together, they proved that even the smallest acts of kindness could light up the darkest corners of society. After all, change wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It was about showing up, listening, and refusing to look away.